Good morning, and welcome to our Sunday presentation. This lodge, United Lodge of Theosophists, Washington, D.C., meets every Sunday at 11 a.m. for the discussion of a particular topic. Today's presentation will be on the Adepts and the birth of America. And next week, we'll be answering the question, why 7? Additionally, at 12:30 p.m. every first and third Sunday of the month, we read and discuss selected theosophical writings. We're currently having roundtable discussions on the Key to Theosophy by H.P. Blavatsky. United Lodge of Theosophists, or ULT, is guided by its declaration, printed on the back of our program, which is here in print, and also on our website. The declaration states the following. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of theosophy, without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of theosophy, and the exemplification and practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among theosophists and the furtherance of unity. It regards as theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization. And it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. We will preface today's talk with a quote from Thomas Paine. Experience in all ages and in all countries has demonstrated that it is impossible to control nature in her distribution of mental powers. She gives them as she pleases. Whatever is the rule by which she, apparently to us, scatters them among mankind, that rule remains a secret to man. It would be as ridiculous to attempt to fix the hereditaryship of human beauty as of wisdom. Whatever wisdom constituently is, it is like a seedless plant. It may be reared when it appears, but it cannot be voluntarily produced. There is always a sufficiency somewhere in the general mass of society for all purposes. But with respect to the parts of society, it is continually changing its place. It rises in one today and another tomorrow, and has most probably visited in rotation every family of the earth, and again withdrawn. As this is the order of nature, the order of government must necessarily follow it, or governments will, as we see it does, degenerate into ignorance. And now for today's talk.
Friends, the subject, Adepts and the Birth of America, is one that we cover on a regular basis at this time of the year in consideration of the 4th of July holiday, Independence Day. It's a worthwhile time to reflect on what Mr. Judge, in a seminal article on this subject, calls the gratitude that we owe to our forefathers in that sense, and in this sense our founding fathers. So the attention is drawn particularly to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was not considered necessarily a founding father, but he was very prominent at the time, and there's a lot of, let's say, mixed history about Thomas Paine's influence in the birth of America. And we're not making any attempt here to say that Thomas Paine himself was an adept or that any of the founding fathers were, only that they were all influenced by the adepts. And the evidence of that is subtle. And so we need to look not only at what we have really as like objective facts and in the writings of the founding fathers, but we have to look at the way events unfolded at the time. And because it was an amazing watershed time for individual rights and liberties and the enlightenment of consciousness that really benefits us even today, not only here but across Europe. So let's start with a little bit about Thomas Paine. It was in 1774, at the age of 37, that he came to America, and he was carrying with him letters of introduction to many of the prominent patriots in the colonies. The letters were written by Benjamin Franklin, who was then in London and had met Paine and was greatly impressed with him. Thomas Paine was immediately, upon coming to Philadelphia, at the center of the turmoil that was preceding the American Revolution. He found the country greatly upset by oppression and unrest. One of his first articles in the Journal, which was the newspaper at the time that was very prominent and he was given the editorship of, one of his first articles was written in defense of African slaves, urging their emancipation. Had that been heeded, we probably could have avoided the death and destruction of the Civil War. This was followed by protest against cruelty to animals and the first plea for women's rights ever published in America. This is just to give you the context of the kind of man that Thomas Paine was and the type of effort that he put into his writings and his actions. The earliest anticipation of the Declaration of Independence came from Thomas Paine. It consisted of an article called A Serious Thought, printed in the Pennsylvania Journal in October 18, 1775. It was in this article, Paine condemned the, quote, horrid cruelties exercised by Britain and prophesied the ultimate secession of the colonies. This article was the forerunner of the pamphlet called Common Sense, perhaps Paine's most famous work. He published this anonymously in January of 1776. So powerfully did Common Sense affect the minds and the hearts of the people of the colonies that it, more than any other factor, produced the Declaration of Independence. And this is borne out by the writings of Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, and many others. George Washington wrote, quote, "Under God, the American people owe their liberty to Thomas Paine more than to any other man." George Washington also wrote, and this is in September 1783, to Paine himself, "I shall be exceedingly happy to see you. Your presence may remind Congress of your past services to this country, and if it is in my power to impress them, command my best exertions with freedom, as they will be rendered cheerfully by one who entertains a lively sense of the importance of your works." And again in 1784, in a letter to Madison, Washington says, "Can nothing be done in our assembly for poor Paine? Must the merits and services of common sense continue to glide down the stream of time unrewarded by this country? His writings certainly have had a powerful effect upon the public mind. Ought they not then to meet an adequate return?" So this is where we won't really have time to go into a lot of the controversy around Thomas Paine. He was in and out of favor amongst whatever population he was in, whether he was in London, whether he was in Philadelphia, or whether he was in Paris. He was controversial everywhere he went. He was constantly fighting for justice and for liberation, regardless of where the source of injustice or a lack of freedom might have been. This meant that at times he would attack George Washington, even people that were supportive of him. And history remembers him in a variety of different ways for this reason, depending on sort of what line of history that you read. It is one of the founding qualities or intentions of the United Lodge of Theosophists to preserve the accurate history of the Theosophical movement. And as a tangent of that, the history around Thomas Paine, it is felt is very important to preserve. In the pamphlet, The Age of Reason, which he wrote in Paris several years later, he says, "I saw, or at least I thought I saw, a vast scene opening itself to the world in the affairs of America. It appeared to me that unless the Americans changed the plan they were then pursuing and declared themselves independent, they would not only improve themselves in a multiplicity of new difficulties, but shut out the prospect that was then offering itself to mankind in their means." Further on he says, "There are two distinct classes of thoughts, those produced by reflection and those that bolt into the mind of their own accord. I have always made it a rule to treat these voluntary visitors with civility, and it is from them that I have acquired all the knowledge that I have." That's a pretty profound statement, and it's clear evidence that he was informed by supersensuous means, that he was not simply reading the old works and the classics and synthesizing them and representing them to this fertile ground of the American and French revolutions. He was doing that, but he was also open to channels of influence that were more than he himself alone was. So this is where Theosophy and the Theosophical movement regards the Adepts' influence in the birth of America. By influencing Thomas Paine and the other founding fathers, it was brought about, the founding of America was brought about without the dogma of the past. Even though the nation was founded by this extremely dogmatic puritanical influence of the refugees that were the Puritans. And every attempt was made by the church to inject that dogma into the organization of the colonies as they grew. It was through the influence of people like Thomas Paine who made an effort to remove that dogmatic God from the writings and from the thought of the time that we owe our freedoms now. So, as an article in Theosophy magazine says, there's a series of articles actually called the Great Theosophists series, and there's 29 parts to it, each one taking up a different historical figure, and it identifies sort of like what their contribution to the Theosophical movement was. As the Declaration says that we regard as Theosophists all those who are in the service to others, and without regard to anything. So many, like Thomas Paine, may never have used the word Theosophy, but were in fact very much in the service of the Theosophical principles. So the series both begins and ends with Thomas Paine. So he's considered a figure significant enough in the pantheon of great Theosophists to not only inaugurate that series, but to precede the second part, which was Jesus Christ, and also to conclude the series with the 29th article in that series. So this article says, "These voluntary visitors were injected into his brain by the Adepts, Theosophists, seeing that a new order of the ages," and we'll maybe circle back to Novus Ordo Seclorum in a moment, "seeing that a new order of the ages was about to commence and that there was a new chance for freedom and the brotherhood of man, they laid before the eye of Thomas Paine, who they knew could be trusted to stand alone and with the lamp of truth in his hand, amidst others who, in times that tried men's souls, quaked with fear. A, quote, vast scene opening itself to mankind in the affairs of America," unquote. The result was the Declaration, the Constitution for America, And as if to give point to these words and to his declaration that he saw this vast scene opening itself, this new order of ages, the design of the reverse side of the U.S. Great Seal is a pyramid whose capstone is removed with the blazing eye in a triangle over it, dazzling the sight. Above it are the words, "The heavens approve," while underneath appeared the startling sentence, "A new order of ages." That he had in his mind's eye a new order of ages we cannot doubt upon reading in his Rights of Man, Part 2, Chapter 2. No beginning could be made in Asia, Africa, or Europe to reform the political condition of man. America made a stand not for herself alone, but for the world, and looked beyond the advantage she could receive. In Chapter 4, the case and circumstance of America presents themselves as in the beginning of a world. There is a morning of reason rising upon man on the subject of government that has not appeared before. This fact that it had not appeared before we'll discuss a little later in a larger context of the qualities of government really from Plato up until today. If we get to that point, I think we'll have time. But it's an important point about this having not appeared before. The design of the Great Seal, that's that circular symbol of the United States, was not an accident. Specifically speaking here, there's two sides to the U.S. Great Seal. Most nations, most Great Seals of any kind, have simply one image. It was considered important for unknown reasons to have a second symbol on the reverse, right? The obverse and the reverse of the Great Seal. And it appears on the dollar bill. You can see it in detail there. So the design, and this means of the back of the Great Seal, was not an accident, but was actually intended to symbolize the building and firm founding of a new order of ages. It was putting into form the idea which, by means of a voluntary visitor, was presented to the mind of Thomas Paine of a vast scene opening itself, beginning in America of a new order of ages. It's an interesting side note that this pyramid and the eye and those Latin phrases didn't appear on the dollar bill until 1935. It was in 1934 that Franklin Roosevelt, that the simply existence of that other side of the seal was brought to his attention. There was a pamphlet written in 1909 by a civil servant detailing, just the facts of the Great Seal. This was brought to FDR, and because FDR was in the process of providing this New Deal to the United States, which was a sweeping social reforms following a terrible economic crisis. He liked the sort of synergy between the new order of the ages and the New Deal. So he ordered that this should now be printed on dollar bills, and it remains there to today. So more is claimed for Theosophical Adepts than the changing of baser metal into gold, or the possession of such a material thing as the elixir of life. They watch the progress of man and help him on in his halting flight up the steep plane of progress. They hovered over Washington, Jefferson, and all the other brave Freemasons who dared to found a free government in the West, which could be pure from the dross of dogmatism. They cleared their minds, inspired their pens, and left upon the Great Seal of this mighty nation the memorial of their presence. On the heels of the American Revolution against the monarchy of England, the French were revolting against their own monarchy. This is in 1789, 1790. So now back in France, Paine wrote The Rights of Man, a work that served in Europe as Common Sense had in America. Paine was pursued by the English government. His book was suppressed. All possible copies were confiscated and burnt. Its circulation was made a crime, and he was given the sentence of outlaw. But the book circulated more furiously on the underground than it ever would have with official permission. So I guess there's no such thing as bad publicity. It was true even then. In France, the National Assembly declared him a citizen of the Republic. Like, France recognized what Paine was doing, whereas in America it was always a struggle. Some official departments elected him as their deputy to the convention. True as ever to the sweet path of true freedom, he voted and spoke against the execution of the king. And for this, Paine was expelled from the assembly, once more declared a foreigner, arrested for treason. He just has these ups and downs. On his way to prison, he hands off to an American friend the manuscript for the first part of his book, The Age of Reason. And during his nearly year-long imprisonment, he writes the second half of The Age of Reason. And the French government is swinging back and forth politically. He's freed after 10 months and restored as both a citizen of France and a member of the French Convention. The absence of the Christian God from the Declaration of Independence and from the Constitution of the United States is due to the influence of Thomas Paine. Religious freedom throughout this broad land where sects thrive, but liberty of conscience still prevails, is due to Thomas Paine. And now, after a century, the vast educative power of the Age of Reason has, as he himself foretold, put the certificate of death upon revealed religion. Most of that is some paraphrasing of these articles, the two articles from the Great Theosophist series, as well as the article by Mr. Judge. Thomas Paine himself said and lived by this motto, and many Theosophists have adopted this motto for themselves: "The world is my country, to do good is my religion." And it's beautifully reminiscent of the Theosophical motto, the movement of the motto of the Theosophical movement, where it says, "There is no religion higher than truth." So much of the Theosophical philosophy, and this gets back to the Adepts, is informed and supported by a body of philosophical writings known as the Mahatma letters. These were actual letters delivered in a variety of mystical and mundane ways, but always attributed as direct communications from the great lodge of Mahatmas, the masters of wisdom. According to a line of Theosophical history, the first Mahatma letter was delivered on November 11th, 1870. This is 5 years and 1 week before the founding of the Theosophical Society. It was not a letter to HPB or AP Sinet, as so many of the subsequent letters were. Rather, it was a letter about HPB. And it was to her aunt. And her aunt was 3 years older than her, so they were very much like sisters, and HPB was, they were very close. And in this letter, were reassuring reports about HPB's absence. She had been abroad now for almost 10 years, mostly in Asia. And the family was very concerned about her. They hadn't heard from her in many, many years, and they were just, despairing for her health and well-being. So HPB asked that they be informed of her good health and her well-being. So the family was reassured by this letter. It was delivered by someone as this noble Russian woman, HPB's aunt, describes, of Asiatic origin. We have to assume that she means Indian or South Asian. She said that the man disappeared before her very eyes after giving her the letter. This woman was not at once a Theosophist. She went on to have a part to play in the Theosophical movement, but she was never considered especially prominent. And at the time of this happening, she considered herself, a good Christian. Exactly 77 years later, to the day when that first Mahatma letter was sent, Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during World War II, and in the early 50s, said, "Many forms of government have been tried, and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." On May 8th, in 1909, that's White Lotus Day, in the same year that the ULT was founded, William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, said, "We are all imperfect. We cannot expect perfect government." After his election in 1976, 200 years after the founding of the United States, the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, said, "Although government has its limits and cannot solve all our problems, we reject the view that we must be reconciled to failures and mediocrity, or to an inferior quality of life. We come through this time of trouble stronger than ever. Like troops who have been in combat, we have been tempered in the fire, we have been disciplined, and we have been educated. Guided by lasting and simple moral values, we have emerged idealists without illusions, realists who still know the old dreams of justice and liberty, of country and of community." 38 years later, speaking about recent legislation changing election campaign finance laws, Jimmy Carter said, "We've become now an oligarchy instead of a democracy, and I think that's been the worst damage to the basic moral and ethical standards of the American political system that I've ever seen in my life." So we see how politics evolves, we see how governments evolve, and we see how what was true at the time for Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Hamilton and Madison and all of these guys is resonant even today, that there is truth in the principles that were laid down then, but that things need to be re-examined in the light of a longer history. In Book 8 of Plato's Republic, he describes the 5 types of government, including aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. And he placed these in order of preference. Notably, democracy is second to the last, better only than tyranny. He quotes Socrates saying that he used the metaphor of democracy as a group of unskilled citizens on a ship taking a vote on who would be captain. That if no one on this ship has the experience to pilot a ship or knows how the ship works, then it's a fool's errand, that it's bound for destruction. He also made the analogy of a doctor versus a candy shop owner, that one is always causing pain, but for the ultimate betterment of the individual, and the other is always providing pleasure, but ultimately with insubstantial consequences. And he argued that the candy shop owner will always get more votes because he's providing that pleasure. And so, again, it's better than tyranny, but it isn't really the ideal form of government, according to Plato and Socrates. Plato, of course, well, and Socrates, regarded aristocracy. And the word we use for aristocracy now is very much colored by our enamorment with democracy. So aristocracy, there's this tendency to grow up, especially in this country, to think that democracy is the best and has always been the best and is regarded that way universally. Aristocracy, of course, must be something less than that. And of course it is the way we've defined it in modern terms. The way Plato defined it was as a rule by philosopher kings. And so we have to look kind of at the context. And in the age during which these ideas were put forth, in the case of Plato and Socrates, the age of Ares, right, was the age of loyalty, boldness, fearlessness, optimism, but also childishness and spontaneity and argumentativeness and competitiveness. So these distinctions in government may have been necessary for that time and made democracy less desirable because of those qualities. When we get to the principles of the 19th century theosophical impulsion of HPB and William Q. Judge, we're at the end of the Piscean age, and the philosophy prominent then was supported by the characteristics of that age. Intuition, inner vision, a subtlety of perspective, spiritual inclination, but also susceptible to rules and dogma. Some of that is a carryover from the age of Aries, but also part of the Piscean character. And now today we find ourselves at the dawn of the Aquarian Age, so these past structures and strictures are naturally being questioned. There's an independence of thought in the Aquarian character, a rejection of dogma and ego, and an acceptance and encouragement of change and innovation, intellectual achievement. All these qualities, of course, have their dark side, being independent to a fault, not accepting the help of others, perhaps, overthinking things, over-intellectualizing, and a lack of commitment, being too willing to change without really giving something its due credit. So democracy may not be Plato's ideal, but may be the most suitable to where we find ourselves now. This is really to every individual to decide. It's not for this platform to speculate, but with a distinct lack of philosopher kings, it may be worthwhile to take a vote. And we should remember the difference between perfection and perfectibility, and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, in the sense that by having, by looking around for philosopher kings and not finding any, but not having any system in place in that absence, we could very easily and quickly drift into tyranny. It was out of tyranny, both in the French Revolution and in the American Revolution, that democracy was born. It was as a rejection of that tyranny. And then it's said that these systems of government evolve over time. So, as I'm going to return quickly to the quote from the opening remarks, where it says, where Thomas Paine says, "Whatever wisdom constituently is, it is like a seedless plant. It may be reared when it appears, but it cannot be voluntarily produced." In this point, there's always a sufficiency somewhere in the general mass of society for all purposes. But with respect to the parts of society, it is continually changing its place. And it would seem to the student that democracy is perhaps the best system we have under the current circumstances to identify that wisdom wherever it may be. That again is open for interpretation. There's another interesting, really brief side note that after all this happened, Thomas Paine was given some consideration by both the federal government and local governments of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New York. He was given some land and he settled here in New Rochelle, New York. He then took on an interest that he'd had all along, but he started to act on this interest that he had in engineering. And he was the first one to architect an iron bridge to replace the stone and wooden bridges that were crumbling all throughout the colonies, or throughout the states, I guess I should say, at that point. And it's as this bridge builder, this architect of bridges, that I think Thomas Paine may be best remembered as, even though it's largely forgotten to history. It's almost just a footnote to anything we read about him. But both practically and metaphorically, he not only built bridges, but repaired bridges and replaced failing bridges with more stable and secure bridges. So that's an interesting aspect to his legacy that probably should be remembered. And again, it is with gratitude that we try to characterize these personalities so that we can both learn from them and their relationship with the philosophy, as well as from their actions and writings. So with that, we'll open it up to any questions or comments on anything we've said.
When Thomas Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls," was he referring to that in his first specific revolution, like the American Revolution?
As I understand it, it was in relation to, if not the revolution itself. I'm not sure exactly when he said that. It may have been right before the actual Declaration of Independence, but it was because there was a lot of struggling and suffering going on in the colonies at the hands of the British. So he may have been referring to that specifically, or it may have been to the larger revolution itself. not sure about the historical timeline there.
About the democracy, is it possible for you to write on the board you mentioned oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, and I think there were one or two more terms.
Yeah, there are five. They're called the five regimes of Plato's Republic, and we can definitely write these down. So this was in Plato's order of preference was aristocracy, and I think timocracy is the next one. And then oligarchy. Democracy and tyranny.
What is democracy?
Yeah, I knew someone would ask that. Tyranny. The distinction between democracy and oligarchy is a little unclear to me. I'm not a scholar of Plato by any means, but tyranny, I think we know, is a despot, like it's just single rule, no freedom. Democracy is a response to that, where the populace becomes fed up with that state of being, and then they get this taste of freedom here in democracy, but that taste of freedom goes too far, and some try to impose, their wealth against others, and so there's this bifurcation in class. Democracy is where there's a return to strict rules, but honor becomes a guiding principle of a democracy. And then aristocracy is he makes this very clear about different types of souls that people are born with. This is not necessarily theosophical philosophy. I'm just going over the history of it for comparison purposes. People can be born with a gold soul or a silver soul. Those two are allowed to be rulers here. But anyone born with a bronze or iron soul are not permitted to be rulers in an aristocracy. Make of that what you will. That's really as much as I know about it. But you'd have to just look this up, I guess, to get a more thorough definition, unless someone else knows the definition.
I was going to ask, I think H.P. also makes some comments on what the best form of government is. Do you remember what she says about that?
I don't.
Okay. I remember democracy is not favored by her. I think
Right.
there's something better that she proposes.
As I recall, she does talk about the philosopher kings of Plato. That was what he was recommending, and I don't think anyone really could deny the value of that. In this student's perspective, I think there's a very narrow definition of these because it was these were defined in the Aryan Age prior to the Piscean Age. The Piscean Age broadens these, there's more overlap, and in the Aquarian Age, these definitions become almost untenable. And so I think we could have a democracy of philosopher kings, in other words. That I think is probably the ideal. I don't know how anyone could argue that would not be ideal. But it requires a populace of gold souls, if you will, right? And this is the Aquarian ideal, that there is education for everyone, that there's a populace, like that anyone on the ship could captain the ship, because everyone is so well educated about navigation and captaining ships, whatever that discipline is called. So that's there will always perhaps be distinctions. We will always be individuals, so it's not so much that anyone could captain the ship, I guess, but that there would be a lot of clarity around who is most suited to captain the ship. And I mean, we can see this even in I mean, there are democracies going on now, right? And they're all at various different states of purity and experimentation and quality. As Jimmy Carter said, as of Citizens United, we probably don't really have a democracy. And he would be one to know, and he would be one who has studied this probably more closely and has a more intimate knowledge of it than any of us. But the upshot of that is, how do we get back to an actual democracy if we assume we don't like the oligarchy? Plato regarded it as superior to democracy. I don't know that anyone today would, except perhaps the oligarchs, right? So, there's a lot that goes into this that is perhaps could be regarded as a side issue from the Theosophical platform. But again, reflecting on the history of the Theosophical movement and how different individuals who weren't necessarily labeled Theosophists or self-identified as Theosophists may have influenced how things played out in terms of the overall enlightenment of mankind and the freedom of thought that we all enjoy is considered worthwhile. So that's why we go there on sort of near the 4th of July in this context. Yeah.
I'm curious to ask a question about the role of emotions perhaps in each type of government. I ask because let's just say I've seen a lot of fictional literacy, literary works in film and,
Sure.
and novels where they present dystopian societies, where repeatedly there's the idea that emotions are something that would need to be repressed, or could the repression of emotions in controlled societies could lead to more authoritarian, more governed societies, and I'm curious if that could be addressed here, or is it differently addressed across all of those 5 styles?
Well, let's take a stab at that. So the question, as I understand it, is about the role of emotion and not only sort of in general, but as it applies to these, and how emotion in the population can affect maybe the success or whatnot of these different types of government. Certainly, emotion plays a part in all of these, and has to be considered. We look at emotion as being part of the kamic nature, K-A-M-A. Put it in red appropriately. So kama, right, is the principle in human nature in the Theosophical system that's responsible for the emotional nature and desire. Even though there are elements of it throughout, our 7 principles, this specifically is sort of the root of our emotional nature. If this is well controlled, let's use the example of an adept or a mahatma, right, where this principle is almost it's been overcome. It has no sway over the individual anymore. One does not get trapped by their passions or their desires or their inclinations or proclivities. They have complete mastery over all of that emotional nature. Then that, of course, is going to make them, or any of us who can do this in any degree, better able to serve others. But I think it's important to acknowledge that within a population there's this entire range of how successful that is, that emotional quality. There are different ways of placating emotions, right? You can provide a population with entertainment and distractions, very much like we see in ancient Rome. Gladiatorial combat and things like that, which distract from the corruption that exists in the government. There may be parallels even to our own lives now, but this is partly to feed this lower nature, this emotional condition, and that allows the higher nature, which is the one that will question things, that will reject dogma, that eschews ego. It prevents that higher nature from rebelling, from taking a hold and insisting on more equality, more fairness, better government, whatever that might be. So you have to look at this history again of the American Revolution, and I think in particular the French Revolution identifies this really well. It was a very, very passionate revolution. It was bloody and violent. There was a lot of emotional churn going on during the French Revolution. Certainly there was in the American Revolution as well, but it seems a little bit more potent in the French Revolution. And some of the evidence of this kind of downstream is Thomas Paine being welcomed as a hero, thrown in prison as a traitor, and then brought back as a hero. Even though he was, from England, helped America reach its independence, brought to France, made a citizen there. There was a lot of chaos and turmoil around that time, and undoubtedly it was because of a deep comic influence on the culture and minds of the populace. Had there been sufficient distractions, perhaps, maybe that revolution would never have taken place. Had this principle been sufficiently satisfied by the material nature of the time, by the material availability of material things at the time, perhaps the revolution would never have happened. So this is the question I think we have to ask ourselves, or what perhaps your question might speak to. How this works in all of these individual cases, I think, would be, an interesting study. One should perhaps pursue that in a deeper, personal way. I don't have enough knowledge of these personally to speak on how they play out in each one of these particular types of government, but this is a whole line of study here that would be quite interesting, though. So thank you for your question. Yeah.
Aldous Huxley, the author who wrote the book Brave New World, to my knowledge, he was friends with Jiddu Krishnamurti, was a member of the Theosophical Society. Is there any awareness of that person being, having been aware, Aldous Huxley being exposed to Theosophy and having allowed maybe perhaps Theosophical principles to influence his way of writing that book, perhaps as a warning about what horrible ends could society come to?
Well, certainly, we could do a whole talk just on Brave New World and the theosophical influences there. There were very few intellectuals and authors who were not in some way familiar with Theosophy, around Huxley's time, and Krishnamurti. I suppose if he was certainly if he was had some connection to Huxley, then Huxley would have at least a basic awareness of Theosophy, if not, in the student's perspective, probably a deep awareness of Theosophy. Again, we don't have to necessarily know the details of that experience. We can look at the fruit, to know the tree. And Brave New World does give us lots of warnings about, government, about freedom of thought, about technology, and the risks that we might encounter if we do not think in new ways about how government should be, how freedoms should be treated, how individuality and individualism should be, if at least permitted, if not encouraged. There's a sweet spot between being overly individualistic. This is what I was saying about the Aquarian, individualism can be taken too far. There has to be still a kind of Piscean altruism and tribalism that, on a positive level, that informs, moving forward in our Aquarian times. But as far as the specific history behind it, I'm not that sure. Maybe someone else knows. But the evidence of it, I think, is in the qualities of Brave New World as a cautionary tale, certainly.
Another book Aldous Huxley wrote, which I believe is like a glaring example that he was familiar with Theosophy, was a book called The Perennial Philosophy.
Right. Yeah.
And that was published as like a 2-book collection with The Doors of Perception.
Okay. Yeah, I had forgotten about the Perennial Philosophy, that was Huxley. So yeah, there's your evidence right there, certainly, that they were connected. And of course that would inform Brave New World.
I have another question, but actually more related to really more recent times. There has been a lot of recent in the news. There has been the case of Edward Snowden, and there is actively a lot of movement in governments, to some extent in secrecy, to try to promote surveillance, enhance surveillance and monitoring of people's privacy through cell phones, everything, and especially in this country, United States. Is that is that something that could lead to perhaps a tyrannical age that's dressed up as a democracy in order to prevent terrorism?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that. And again, from the platform of the ULT, it's not necessarily. I guess the way it's phrased in the declaration is it has neither the time nor inclination to take part in side issues. So without taking part, meaning I'm not going to take sides in this one way or the other, there are some objective facts, if we can even use that term in sort of our post-fact world now. But there is a direct equality between privacy and freedom, right? So we can't, if we can't speak out against whatever the rules are of the age, whatever the time we're living in, if there's no platform which we can discuss with others in a private way, reflect personally about what our conditions are and about the justice or injustice of the world we find ourselves in. If there's no privacy to do that, if that ability is hindered in some way, that is a hallmark of tyranny, right? So we have to objectively identify failures in the privacy of the populace as elements of tyranny, right? Regardless of Edward Snowden and the NSA and deep state and all these things that are no doubt real and impactful, and may have contributed to what Jimmy Carter was saying about it being an oligarchy now and not a democracy. That's whether or not that has anything to do with terrorism or tyranny is maybe another subject. If we look objectively at the science around fear, we were talking about emotions earlier, and how fear is utilized to manipulate a population. If we look at the source of the fear-mongering that is present and look at the objective incidents of terrorism, things start to fall apart. So we start to see that there is a lot of manipulation, there is a lot of failures to enforce privacy, and these very well may be a hallmark of a slipping, outside of what would be considered a positive democracy and into either an oligarchy, a democracy where the rules are very strict and allegiance is demanded, or possibly to tyranny. But whether this is for some greater good, because it's all being overseen by the adepts, that's another perspective, right? Maybe there's a point to all of these things happening that we, in our disconnect from our higher natures and our inability to see the world through the eyes of the adepts, we can't see how important certain things are to a larger whole. There's a kind of utilitarianism and pragmatism that goes with philosophy that should be regarded at least, or taken into consideration, even if it's not necessarily relevant. There may be something to it. Any other?
Just brief question. What was? Can you repeat again the phrase about the captain and democracy? That it's a metaphor that was somewhat funny. But
yeah, I mean, this is not a direct quote. It's just the way it was characterized, and it's you know the way the Republic is written is like a dialogue between many people, but in this case between Socrates and Plato, and he said. Here it is, yeah. So he says Socrates used the metaphor of democracy as a group of unskilled citizens on a ship taking a vote on who would be captain, rather than it just going to the most skilled person. Like whoever has piloted a ship before should be the one who should be captain. This was Plato's metaphor for, to govern the people requires someone with the skills to govern people. With the fundamental nature. He called it a gold soul, or a silver soul. Someone who was born from past lives carries with him or her the qualities necessary to guide a nation. That's not something that every single person in a population may have the best qualities to do. Having said that, though, I think it's worth noting there's kind of a relatively easy rejoinder to say that in a democracy, especially a well-educated democracy, we can weed those out, right? So that if you have a candy shop owner and a doctor both running, we can move beyond the initial impulse to vote for the person who's giving us this immediate pleasure but nothing substantive, and vote instead for the person who may have our best interests in mind, or has our best interests in mind, but may also require us to go through some kind of pain in order to get to someplace better, the doctor. And Plato had just very, very, very little faith in the population. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And in the age of Aries, that may have been justified. The population, we've come a long way, as people, as individual members of society. And by a long way, I mean literally thousands of years of evolution as societies globally. That probably qualifies, if nothing else, then for a reconsideration of these relatively dusty concepts. Okay, thank you very much. And next week, first we have I don't have a program. First we have our afternoon roundtable, and then next week is
Y7.
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 Y7. Join